everyone, and welcome to week 7 of our course, where we will be shifting gears away from the public sector and funding the public sector, and now taking a look at the relationship between elasticity and demand. Moving forward in our course, we'll really be changing our focus away from general economic theory and principles, and now taking a much closer look at microeconomic theory and principles. I wanted to quickly forewarn you before diving into the material into chapter 19 that this chapter and the chapters moving forward will really start to use the principles of ratios, slope, proportions, and angles. If any of these concepts seem foreign to you, I want you to take a moment before going into chapter 19 to go on to Khan Academy and search ratios, slope, proportions, and angles. This is especially true if it's been a little while since you've had the opportunity to take a math course. The first principle we're introduced to in chapter 19 is this idea of elasticity. And elasticity can be defined as the relationship of how a change in price affects the quantity demanded for a given good. We'll recall from chapter 3 of our course that we defined the law of demand as generally when the price of a good increases, quantity demanded for that given good goes down. Elasticity can be expressed as a ratio, and this ratio looks something like this. Elasticity is equal to the change in quantity demanded divided by the change in price. In chapter 19 and moving forward in our course, you'll often see this delta symbol. And anytime you see this delta symbol or triangle, you can think of a marginal change. Elasticity can also be expressed by the slope of our demand curve. In chapters 3 and 4, we drew out our demand curve, and we generally drew it out at a 45-degree angle, where a change in price would be proportional to the change in quantity demanded. This isn't always the case though, and this demand curve can change its angle from this 45-degree angle to a complete vertical line like this. And on the other side of the coin, it can go from a 45-degree angle all the way out to a complete horizontal line like this. When our demand curve has a 45-degree angle slope like this, we call this special case unit elastic. And this is where our elasticity ratio here is 1:1, meaning the change in the price of 1 changes quantity demanded by 1. When it's not quite as severe as that 1:1 relationship and elasticity is less than 1, it can go from this 45-degree angle all the way up to a perfectly vertical line. This proportion of elasticity is called being inelastic. When it goes to this perfect vertical line, we call it perfectly inelastic. Some examples of inelastic goods are goods that do not respond as severely to price changes of other goods. We'll think, for example, of tobacco. Consumers of tobacco are generally addicted to tobacco, and because of that addiction, they are not going to respond as severely to a price increase in tobacco as they might other goods. An example of a perfectly inelastic good might be a medication that you need to use to live. It does not matter how high the price of that medication gets, you're going to continue purchasing it because you need that medication to live. On the flip side of the coin, an elastic good is any good from this 45-degree angle all the way down to a horizontal line, which we are going to be calling perfectly elastic. We think of some goods that are elastic. We think of goods that are easily substituted. This might change with individuals' tastes and preferences, but generally we can think of some things like baking goods, like flour and sugar. A lot of people don't have brand preferences of these given goods. And so if the price of one brand of flour or sugar increases, they're generally just going to go for that substitute good. Which leads us to our first question. What affects elasticity? Well, there's a few things. The first thing we've talked about a little bit, and that's the availability of substitutes. Keep in mind, the availability of substitutes can differ with individuals' tastes and preferences. For example, if my Android phone went up in price, I think a perfectly good substitute would be an Apple phone. Some other users might have a different opinion. If the price of Pepsi goes up, well, a lot of consumers would just buy Coke. If that availability of a substitute is there, it is going to make that good more elastic. Also, budget constraints really affect an individual's need for elasticity. If you have a very, very low budget constraint, meaning you make a lot of money, you're not going to be as extreme of changing your quantity demanded with an increase of price. However, if you have a tight budget constraint, even the smallest change in price is going to have you going to another good. And finally, the last factor is this idea of time to adjustment. Let's think of electricity as an example. If your electricity prices, where you get electricity from coal, all of a sudden skyrocketed up quickly, you would have the availability of a substitute of solar panels. However, the time it takes to get these solar panels, get them installed, and get them working takes time. And this is a constraint on the elasticity of our good. At the start of the lecture, I introduced this very important ratio. As you approach the end of our chapter, you'll see a lot of different ratios in order to calculate the different factors involving elasticity. Keep your bookmark thumbed on those ratios because we'll go through a lot of homework problems regarding the ratio of elasticity. And finally, just as we learned about the applicable different natures of the supply curve and how they relate to the demand curve, elasticity also applies to our supply curve. And there are equations and ratios related not only to the demand elasticity, but the supply elasticity. Ratios, slopes, proportions, and angles can be difficult. So, as always, if you need any help with our homework this week, please, please, please feel free to reach out to me. I'm always happy to work through a few homework problems. And I mean that. Don't be shy to reach out, and I'm happy to work with you and make sure that you're successful in this chapter and moving forward in our class. We'll talk soon. Thanks.